Hey there, Philip the Librarian here to review the new book Nick by Michael Farris Smith. The novel Nick is a prequel to The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and in theory that sounds like a questionable idea. I'm not a big fan of The Great Gatsby. Nick was not a very likable character, and prequels don't always work out too well. Nevertheless, I liked this book. The central image of Nick is fire. There is no subtlety about this. You can literally see flames on the cover of the book. 3 fires occur as major plot points in the story. The novel frequently mentions people lighting matches. Nick's father has an odd habit of lighting newspapers on fire for some reason. And 2 of the characters are described as burning from the inside. I am referring to Judah and Colette. I'll get to them later. Michael Farris Smith describes the raw passion and terror of a fire. High streaks of yellow and orange leaped into the sky as if reaching for redemption. Now, fire is often a symbol of rage or narcissism, but here I think it functions as a symbol of getting rid of the past. Because Nick is not a novel about destruction, even though it has a world war in it. It's a novel about loss. It actually begins with an epigram, which is simply the Welsh word hiraeth, and its definition, a sense of longing for something that is gone or perhaps never existed. The story begins with Nick in France, fighting during World War I, and the first few pages are about Nick hanging out in Paris, waiting to be called back to the front. We get a sense of foreboding here because Paris is lovely, but we know these lovely scenes can't last. We know we have to get back to the fighting soon. Similarly, he has started an affair with a French woman named Ella, and we know this is not going to last either. He has to leave her when he goes back to the front, and of course we get some descriptions of fighting, followed by the first of the 3 fires. Nick's battalion gets surprised by a huge explosion, and the German soldiers pile up the bodies of Americans and set them on fire. Nick wakes up just in time and wriggles out of the pile of bodies, and he hears another man crying out for help, but Nick knows he can't stop to save him. While Nick is in France, we get flashbacks to Nick's life growing up, and the troubles he had with his family. He describes his mother's mysterious withdrawal from life, from chronic depression or chronic fatigue syndrome or something else. It was not clear to me. She just spent more and more time in bed. But it affected Nick. It made him feel alienated from his own family and maybe from society in general. And we can see how Ella, the French woman, reawakens something in Nick that was dormant for a long time. Ella represents the possibility of starting a new family and thus reclaiming the innocence that he lost when he was a kid when his mother became sick. He lets this opportunity slip away because of his duty in the war. After the war is over, he looks for Ella again, but he can't find her, and he actually follows other women around and pictures himself romancing them instead because he knows he'll never find Ella again. By no coincidence, when he first met Ella, she was out selling empty picture frames, big empty rectangles without a picture in the middle. Now, this brings me back to the same problem I had with Gatsby, that of unrelieved loneliness. I don't mind works about horrible situations and destructive people and problems with our society. What I mind is how some works use these things to come to a conclusion that is ultimately pessimistic and does not emphasize that there is still some good in the world. At one point in France, Nick is resting in a house next to a fenced area where they keep German prisoners of war. Nick watches some American soldiers teasing some starving Germans with pieces of bread. Nick is tempted to tell the American soldiers to stop being so cruel, but he doesn't. The closest we get to human decency in this book is an old couple in France who take care of Nick after he's injured, and he can't even communicate with them because he doesn't speak French. My other pet peeve with this novel is the lack of unity. It essentially has 2 plots. After Nick returns to the United States, his family invites him back to stay with them in Minnesota, But instead of going there, Nick goes to New Orleans because he thinks Ella might somehow be in New Orleans. After staying there for about a week, he goes to a bar run by a woman named Colette, and then suddenly the bar gets burned to the ground, along with half the block around it. Fire number 2. And then the rest of the novel is basically about who started this fire, why, the aftermath of it, and Nick's perception of it. This isn't a spoiler review, but I'm not giving much away when I say that someone started the fire intentionally because of some grief that was caused by World War I. A man named Judah and the woman Colette wanted to be together, but Judah got enlisted in the army, and then he got listed as dead, so she moved on and both of their hearts got broken. Another missed opportunity because of the war, a sort of parallel to Nick and Ella. At one point we see another man grieving his child who got burned to death in the fire, and Nick feels a connection with this man, not only because they both failed to save someone from a fire, but also because this man has lost his family, just as Nick felt that he lost part of his family during his childhood. But the connection just doesn't go anywhere. Nick doesn't act on this connection, he just gets depressed and closes himself off from everyone else. The man named Judah feels an instant connection to Nick the first time they meet, but Judah describes it as a connection of shared negative experiences, and Judah actually reflects, if there is one thing the lost are able to recognize, it is the others who are just as wounded and wandering. And later Nick reciprocates that connection with Judah. Something opened inside of Nick as he sat next to this man, something vast and infinite that was without a name but as familiar to him as his own reflection, and in that moment he believed that he would never find his place. But to Nick, this recognition is depressing and sterile, and again, it just doesn't go anywhere. Judah and Nick actually have a conversation where Judah says, "It ain't your fault what you had to do, just like it ain't mine. That fire was lit before I was even born. We only drift toward what we already been set to do." Nick says, "You had a choice." Judah says, "If that's what you think." Nick says, "You don't have to hurt people because they hurt you." And Judah replies, "Yeah, you do." Judah describes interpersonal relationships as predestined firewood, set to burn as soon as people rub each other the wrong way. Now, if a character wants to say this, fine, but Nick never really disproves Judah's words. In fact, Nick later takes a gun and chases after another man. The relationship between Nick and Judah is never what I would call friendship, and at the same time, Nick doesn't do much to contradict Judah. Again, we see so much loss in this story. Nick loses Ella, Judah and Colette lose each other, John LaFell loses his child. The novel also makes several mentions of prohibition, and specifically how untimely prohibition was. Men had just come back from the war, and after experiencing horrors in Europe, they wanted to get drunk. They wanted to forget everything they had lost, and prohibition made that very difficult. Toward the end of the novel, Colette apprehends the man who actually started the fire that burned down her brothel, and she steals the belongings of the other man who sent him. But all of this does not make her happy because it does not bring back what she lost, the hope and love that she once felt. Her only solution is to burn down her new house, just like her bar get burned down. And she reflects, this life will be no more. Hence, fire number 3. To me, Nick feels like an inert, unsure story. It's not bleak, but I feel like it doesn't really commit to anything. But again, that is similar to the problem I have with The Great Gatsby, and apparently people have loved that novel for 95 years, so I guess I'm missing something. The only issue I'm still pondering is, does Nick work as a prequel to The Great Gatsby? Prequels do get a bad rap. I wonder why. And you could argue that a prequel is kind of a self-contradiction, something that follows the original work, but is supposed to take place before it. Now, ideally, a sequel is a work that takes the elements of the first work and builds upon them. Thus, it continues in the trend of the original work, but it is also different in that it goes further and shows new conflicts between the forces already introduced in the first work. But you can't quite apply the same formula to a prequel, because you can't expand upon a story that isn't supposed to have taken place yet. So, like I said, you can argue that a prequel is kind of a bad idea, but it keeps getting done, and I think it occasionally gets done well. And I think the key to making a good prequel is to focus on one aspect of the original work and just develop that one aspect. For example, in Rogue One, we see a concrete, elaborate portrayal of how the rebels obtained the Death Star plans. It focused on that one element of Star Wars and gave us a plausible story about it. So if we assume, for the sake of argument, that this is one way in which a prequel can succeed, then the question becomes, does Nick do this? Does it focus on one aspect of The Great Gatsby in a way that connects to the original work? And I think the answer is yes. The Great Gatsby starts with Nick monologuing about the general dishonesty of the world and how Gatsby is exempt from my reaction, because Gatsby has an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness that no one else possesses. In Nick, he regrets how he clung to useless traditions and obligations instead of staying with Ella, whereas Gatsby lets go of everything in order to pursue Daisy. And I think Nick admires that. So, yes, I feel like Nick sets up Nick Calloway in a way that works consistently with The Great Gatsby. So, that's my review of Nick. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree? Leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching, and feel free to subscribe to my channel. This is Philip the Librarian, signing off.